The ballroom was all gold light and moving mouths. Caroline Weston walked in, and everyone saw the CEO. No one saw the small hand crushing hers. Iris pressed herself against her mother's side, rigid, silent, eyes down. She had been this way for 3 years, ever since the illness took her hearing and, somewhere in the silence that followed, took her courage too. She didn't look up, not for the chandeliers, not for the music she couldn't hear. Then a man in a work jacket crouched down in front of her. His hands moved. "You look like someone who's really good at finding the best hiding spot in a room." Iris stared. Then slowly, she signed back. And then she laughed. Caroline had not heard that sound in 3 years. The Langham Hotel in Chicago knew how to make wealth look like generosity. Crystal chandeliers pushed gold light down over tables, set with linen that cost more per yard than most people's grocery bills. And the string quartet in the corner played something tasteful and non-threatening, and the guests moved through the room with the practiced ease of people who had attended enough of these evenings to stop noticing the effort behind them. It was the Weston Foundation's annual charity gala, the largest fundraising event on the foundation's calendar. The evening Caroline had spent 6 weeks preparing for, and the room she knew better than almost any other. She had walked through the entrance at 8 o'clock precisely, the way she always arrived exactly on time, because time was the one currency she controlled without negotiation. She had worn the black dress she wore to these things, said hello to the people she needed to say hello to, and picked up her first glass of sparkling water with the automatic confidence of a woman who has never once walked into a room and doubted whether she belonged there. What she had not prepared for, in 6 weeks of logistics and donor management and program talking points, was her daughter. Iris Weston was 9 years old, dressed in a navy dress her grandmother had chosen, her dark hair pinned back in a style that made her look older and somehow more exposed at the same time. She had small hearing aids fitted behind each ear, flesh-toned, barely visible, the most expensive kind available. And from the moment they had stepped through the hotel doors, she had pressed herself against Caroline's side and held on. Not the easy closeness of a child who is comfortable and content, the rigid, white-knuckled closeness of a child who is frightened and has nowhere else to go. The ballroom was not a place that had anything to offer Iris. The mouths all moved in conversations she could not access. The laughter rose and fell around her as vibration in the floor, sourceless and strange. The lights were beautiful, and the lights did not speak. She kept her eyes down and her shoulder against her mother's arm, and she did not let go. She used to be different. Before the fever, before the 6 days in the hospital when she was 6 years old, before the morning the doctors explained to Caroline and her late husband what had been permanently, irreversibly changed, Iris had been the loudest child in any room she entered. She had been the girl who introduced herself to strangers in grocery store checkout lines, who narrated cartoons even with the volume turned all the way up, who laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, and didn't care that nobody else knew the punchline yet. She had been entirely, exuberantly herself, and she had never once needed anyone's permission to take up space. Then the meningitis came for her at 6 years old, and when it left, it took the world of sound with it. And in the long, difficult months of recovery that followed the hearing aids, the specialist visits, the new school, the new everything, Iris had taken the version of herself that had been loud and brave and unafraid, and tucked it somewhere she couldn't find anymore. 3 years had passed. Not her teachers, not her classmates, not the ASL tutor who came 3 times a week, not even her mother, who had tried in every way she knew how to try, had been able to reach it. Tonight, the ballroom was just another room in a long series of rooms that had nothing in it for Iris. She kept her shoulder against her mother's arm and her eyes on the floor, and she waited for it to be over. Caroline, working the room with the efficiency of someone who had done it 100 times, was aware of Iris beside her the way she was aware of everything as an item on the list of things she was managing. She made introductions, accepted compliments about the program, answered questions about the foundation's initiatives, and kept one hand near her daughter without looking at her directly. It was the closest she knew how to be. Lately, she was better at proximity than presence. James Whitfield was near the front of the stage when he first saw the girl. He had been contracted for the evening through the AV company he worked for sound setup, lighting rig, the hearing loop system the foundation had requested for the stage. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular physical economy of a man who has spent 20 years carrying equipment and has learned not to waste motion. He was packing a cable coil into his kit bag, mentally calculating how long the breakdown would take after the event, when he walked past the edge of the room and saw the child standing beside a woman in a black dress. He saw the posture first. He always noticed posture before faces, because posture told you the true story faster. Shoulders pulled in, eyes down, body turned slightly inward, away from the room, as though she was trying to take up less space than she already did. He knew that posture the way he knew the particular weight of certain tools through years of repeated handling until recognition was automatic. His son Luke had carried himself exactly that way for nearly 2 years after Sarah died. James had watched it happen and had not known for a long time how to address it. He stopped walking. The girl had hearing aids. He could see them from where he stood, the small flesh-tone devices behind each ear, the kind designed to be inconspicuous. He set his cable coil down, slowly, without making the decision consciously, the way you sometimes act before you've finished thinking. He crossed to where the girl was standing and crouched down so that he was at her eye level, which was the first rule he had learned: always come down to where they are. Never make them look up at you. She looked at him with the particular wariness of a child who has been disappointed often enough to be careful. He raised his hands and signed, slowly and clearly, making sure each shape was visible. You look like someone who's really good at finding the best hiding spot in a room. She stared at him. Her hands stayed at her sides. He waited without impatience, because impatience was the thing that closed children off, and he had learned a long time ago that waiting was often the most useful thing you could do. Then her small hands came up. Careful, slightly unpracticed. There aren't any good ones here. He looked around the ballroom with genuine consideration, turning his head slowly, assessing. Then he signed, "The curtain behind the stage, third panel from the left. Perfect width. Nobody ever checks the third one." Iris looked at the curtain. She looked back at him, and something in her face, the careful blankness that had settled there over 3 years, the particular stillness of a child who has learned to want nothing shifted, just slightly, like a window cracking open in a room that had been sealed too long. And then she laughed. Not a polite sound, not a performance. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that lives in the part of yourself you've forgotten to protect. Caroline, standing 2 feet away in the middle of a sentence she was no longer finishing, heard it. She stood very still. She did not trust herself to speak. The technical failure came 40 minutes later, midway through the program. The stage microphone system released a high-frequency squeal that cut across the dinner conversation and turned 300 heads toward the stage with uniform displeasure. Caroline was moving before the echo faded, crossing to the stage manager, requesting a timeline, doing what she did in every moment of disruption, which was locate the problem and apply force to it. The stage manager was reaching for his radio when James appeared from the side corridor, kit bag over one shoulder, expression unbothered in the way of a man who has seen worse malfunctions than this one before breakfast. Caroline looked at him. "How long?" she asked. He held up 7 fingers. Then he turned and climbed the stage steps without further explanation. She was not, in her professional life, accustomed to being answered in gestures and then turned away from. She stood at the edge of the stage with her arms crossed and watched him work, pulling the equipment panel with practiced ease, identifying the fault with the efficiency of someone who has diagnosed this category of problem many times before, replacing the component, running a test tone. 6 minutes and 43 seconds. He came down the steps, glanced at her once with the expression of a man who gave a number and kept it, and walked toward the side corridor. He was almost past the corner table when Iris reached out and touched his sleeve. He stopped. She signed something quicker than before, less careful, the ASL of a child who has been reminded that her hands work. He watched her hands, then signed something back, a short sequence that involved a shape Caroline didn't recognize. Iris watched. Then she laughed again, the same real laugh as before, unguarded and completely herself. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Caroline was 8 feet away. She had been walking toward James with some half-formed intention, gratitude, or a question. She hadn't decided. And the sound of her daughter laughing stopped her where she stood. She stayed there. She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathed. She did not walk forward. James looked up and found her face across the room. He held her gaze for a moment, the gaze of a man who isn't sure what he has just done but can see from the woman's expression that it was something. He gave a small nod and turned to go. Caroline followed him. She found him in the service corridor behind the main hall, coiling cable with the muscle memory efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times. She walked in and stood at the edge of the space, and for a moment she did not speak, which was unusual for her. She was very good at starting conversations. "Where did you learn to sign like that?" she asked. He looked up without stopping his hands. "My son," he said. "He was born deaf. I learned because I didn't have another option." She was quiet for a moment. The music from the ballroom moved through the wall, muffled and formal and very far away. "How old is he?" 10. "Iris is 9, she said. And then, because it had been pressing against her all evening and had nowhere else to go, she lost her hearing 3 years ago. Meningitis. James set the cable coil down. He looked at her fully, not the quick assessment of earlier, but something more attentive, more present. "That's harder in some ways," he said. "Having a language and then losing access to it." "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood in the service corridor for 20 minutes. He asked practical questions about Iris's school, her program, the support structure she had. He did not ask about the foundation. He did not ask about money or scale or outcomes. He asked about the particular and the specific, the way a parent asks, because those were the things that actually mattered to him. And Caroline, who was very practiced at talking about childhood hearing loss as a policy matter, found herself instead talking about the way Iris still sometimes moved her mouth to music she could feel through the floor, and how that was both heartbreaking and quietly extraordinary, and how she hadn't told anyone that before because she hadn't known it was the kind of thing you could say out loud. She did not introduce herself. He did not ask. When they drifted back toward the ballroom, he knew only what the evening had shown him: a mother who cared, who was working hard, who was more honest when she forgot to be careful. She knew almost nothing about him either. But she walked back through those doors aware of something she hadn't been aware of when she'd walked out: that her daughter had laughed twice tonight, and both times it had had nothing to do with her. She filed that somewhere she could not ignore. The gala ran until 11:30. Caroline spent the final hour in conversation with people whose names she would remember and whose faces she was already beginning to forget. The ordinary work of an evening like this, the maintenance of relationships that kept the foundation funded and functional. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. At 11:10, she looked across the room and saw Iris asleep in her chair. Fully asleep, head tipped to one side, one hand open on the white tablecloth, the posture of a child who had been, at some point in the preceding hours, genuinely at ease. It was not a posture Iris usually allowed herself in public. Something in Caroline's chest moved, not comfortably. She excused herself and began crossing the room. She was halfway there when she stopped. James was crouched beside Iris's chair. He had come back to retrieve the last piece of equipment near the stage, a monitor cable draped over the chair legs. He took the cable, straightened, and looked at the sleeping girl for a moment. Then he looked at his work jacket over his arm and laid it carefully across Iris's shoulders. The motion was without ceremony, without hesitation, the automatic gesture of a man who has covered a sleeping child 1,000 times, who does it because the alternative is simply not acceptable. He tucked the edge of the jacket under her arm. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching. Caroline stood in the middle of the ballroom floor and did not move. The hedge fund manager she had been talking to was still talking, somewhere behind her. The string quartet was playing something final. She stood and watched a man she didn't know cover her daughter with his jacket as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and she felt, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, the weight of what she had not done, not just tonight, for 3 years. The morning after the gala, Claire sent the routine vendor recap, a standard document, security protocol, names and companies for all contracted staff. Caroline's assistant filed it. Caroline opened it. She found the name James Whitfield, Whitfield AV Services, Pilsen, Illinois. She moved the document to a folder she could find again. She told herself this was procedural. She was not entirely convinced. 2 weeks after that, she sat across a conference table from Senator Aldrich Bowen and listened to him explain what he required in exchange for his support of the Foundation's expanded hearing-impaired initiative. His name attached to the program. Shared oversight of fund disbursement. A portion of the budget redirected toward his district's infrastructure, framed, in the language he used, as complementary investment rather than extraction. He was reasonable about it, in the way that powerful men are reasonable when they are asking for something they believe you cannot refuse. "You're building something very expensive for a very small audience, Caroline," he said at the end. He said it kindly. It was not a kind thing. "I know exactly what I'm building," she said, "and I know exactly why I'm building it." She smiled, thanked him for his time, and ended the meeting. On the elevator ride down from the 43rd floor, She stood alone in the mirrored box and allowed herself 30 seconds of the particular exhaustion that comes from being right and unsupported, the weight of building something worth building in a world that keeps suggesting you build something smaller instead. Then the doors opened and she walked out into the lobby and got into her car and went to pick up Iris from her grandmother's house. James read about her in the Chicago Tribune on a Tuesday morning. The paper had run a feature on the Gala, a full page with photographs, and one of the photographs was a wide shot of Caroline Weston accepting a ceremonial check, her name in the caption, CEO, Weston Foundation. The article described the foundation's record fundraising year and mentioned the Hearing Impaired Children's Initiative as its flagship program. He sat with the paper for a while. The photograph showed her smiling a good smile, composed and gracious and entirely appropriate to the occasion. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he thought about the woman in the service corridor, talking about her daughter mouthing the words to songs she could feel in the floor. He tried to reconcile the two and found that he could. They were obviously the same person, but the distance between those two expressions was larger than most people in that photograph probably knew. He folded the paper. He thought about it for the rest of the week. 5 weeks after the gala, the Weston Foundation ran its first pilot workshop for hearing-impaired children at Marcus Elementary School on the South Side. The program combined ASL enrichment, hearing loop technology, and peer socialization for children across a range of hearing profiles. Claire had coordinated the logistics, and the logistics included a last-minute AV installation that the Foundation's regular contractor couldn't cover. Claire called 3 companies. The first one to call back, with a crew available that Saturday, was Whitfield AV Services. James was the one who came. He recognized the Foundation name from the paperwork before he recognized the address, and he put it together fully only when he walked through the gymnasium door and saw Caroline Weston standing in front of a projector screen, pressing buttons on a laptop with the focused frustration of someone who refuses to acknowledge they need help. Around her, 12 children between the ages of 7 and 12 sat in a rough semicircle on folding chairs, waiting with the particular patience of children who have learned that adults take longer to solve things than they should. The ASL interpreter was stuck in traffic on the Dan Ryan. The teacher's aide stood to one side, looking uncertain. James set his equipment bag down inside the door. He looked at the children for a moment. Then he walked to the semicircle, pulled out an empty chair, and sat down. He made eye contact with a small boy with red hair who was kicking his heels against the chair legs and signed, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The boy stared at him, then signed back, "A pilot." The girl beside him signed, "Pilots have to use the radio." The boy signed, "I'll figure it out." James signed, "Fair enough." And the semicircle cracked open, and the other children leaned in. And by the time the interpreter arrived 20 minutes later, they were deep into a signed debate about whether it would be harder to be a pilot or a deep-sea diver. And nobody was waiting for anything. Luke was there that morning. James had brought him because Luke's school had an in-service day, and James did not leave his 10-year-old alone for 6 hours, even at 10. Luke sat at the edge of the semicircle in his jacket and watched the new children with the measured assessment of a kid who has been the only deaf person in a room too many times to rush the process of figuring out who was worth trusting. Then Iris walked in with her mother. Luke saw her first. He sat up slightly. Iris saw Luke and stopped walking. They looked at each other with the recognition of two people who have already, without formal introduction, decided to be on the same side of something. Then Iris sat down in the chair beside him, and within 30 seconds they were signing to each other at a speed that suggested they had significantly more to say than the available time had so far permitted. Caroline stood at the edge of the gymnasium with her laptop closed under her arm and watched her daughter's hands move. She watched Iris's face open, unguarded, entirely present, the face of a child who is fully and completely herself. She became aware that James was standing a few feet away, also watching. She looked at him. He looked at her. The gymnasium was loud with the happy disorder of children who have found each other, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing to say that would have added to what was already there. After the workshop, Caroline suggested coffee. She kept her voice casual, as though it were a logistical matter, as though she simply needed to debrief with a vendor about the technical setup. James agreed with equal casualness, as though neither of them were doing anything other than that. They went to a place on 18th Street that James clearly knew: small, busy, mismatched chairs, coffee in large ceramic mugs. It was as far from the Langham Hotel as Chicago geography could manage. Caroline sat across from him in her foundation blazer and felt, for the second time since the gala, the specific relief of being somewhere nobody was watching her be Caroline Weston. She asked about Luke, telling herself it was research, and partly it was. But she also just wanted to know. James talked without performance. He described the first year after Sarah died, the year he had hired specialists in aides because he hadn't known how to be the only parent of a deaf child, and he'd been deep enough in his own grief to tell himself the professionals knew better than he did. Sarah had been the one who was learning ASL with Luke. She had been the one who attended every session with the school's deaf education coordinator, who came home and practiced new signs over dinner, who had the natural ease with language that James had always admired in her and quietly envied. When she died, she took all of that with her, and what remained was James and a 5-year-old boy, and a silence between them that James had not known how to fill. He had hired people. He had told himself that was responsible. He had stood at the edge of his son's life and managed it from there, because management was the only tool he had. He described the night he found Luke crying silently in the corner of his bedroom, in the particular way that deaf children cry, all of it held inside, none of it audible, the grief moving through the body without sound. James had stood in the doorway and understood, with the clarity of a man who has been fooling himself, that he could not reach his son, that he had built a structure around Luke's life and forgotten to actually be inside it. He described the drive to a 24-hour Walmart at 1 in the morning to buy an ASL workbook from the craft and hobby aisle because it was the only place he could think of that might carry one. The woman at the register had asked if he was all right. He had said yes. He had driven home and sat at the kitchen table and opened the book and started on page 1, and he had not stopped. "What changed?" Caroline asked. "Between not knowing and knowing." He turned the ceramic mug in his hands. "I stopped framing it as something I was doing for him," he said. "Learning to sign. Being at the school. All of it. I used to think I'm doing this to help Luke, and then I realized I was doing it to be with him. Not to fix anything. Not to manage the situation. Just to actually be in the room with him." He paused. "There's a difference between running a room and sitting in it." Caroline was quiet. She had been quiet for most of the conversation, which was not her natural mode. She was a person who filled silences. It was one of the things she was paid for. But she sat with what he had said and felt it press against something she had been carefully not examining for 3 years. The best specialists, the best school, the best technology, the best program. All of it organized, funded, executed from the outside. All of it managed, from the edge of the room, by a woman who was very good at managing things from edges. The tears came quietly, the way they always did for Caroline, efficiently, without drama, as though her body had found the shortest route to the feeling and taken it. She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathed. "She doesn't need a better program," James said. His voice was gentle, but it was not the gentleness of someone choosing their words carefully. It was simpler than that. "She needs you to stop running the room and just sit in it with her." He hadn't known he was saying something significant. She could tell it was simply what was true, stated the way true things are stated by people who haven't yet learned to wrap them in enough softening that they lose their shape. That was the only reason it went all the way in. She sat with it. He let her. It was, she thought, a very long time later, the most useful conversation she had ever had in a coffee shop. The story broke on a Wednesday. A quote appeared in the Tribune's political column, attributed to a source close to Senator Bowen's office, raising concerns about the foundation's allocation priorities and suggesting that recent decisions might not reflect the full breadth of community need. The language was carefully vague, impossible to refute directly, and precisely calibrated to make 3 corporate donors nervous enough to request calls. By Thursday morning, 2 of them had. Claire called before 7. "We need to talk about how we're managing this." "I know," Caroline said. "There are ways to handle it that don't require you to—" "I'll handle it," Caroline said. Margaret called at 7:30. She did not ask about the senator or the donors or the foundation's communications calendar. She asked how Iris was doing. Had Caroline noticed she seemed a little different lately, a little more present at the dinner table, a little more likely to sign unprompted? Had she seen the drawing on the kitchen counter, the one with the 2 children and the man with very large hands? Caroline had seen the drawing. She had not asked about it. "She's doing better," Caroline said. And then, because it was Margaret, and because Margaret had been watching her with clear-eyed patience since her husband died 4 years ago, "I'm trying to do better too." She held the press conference on Friday afternoon with no prepared remarks. She had written 3 drafts, each more precisely calibrated than the last, and left all 3 on her kitchen counter. She drove to the hotel meeting room with nothing except her phone and the knowledge of what she actually needed to say. She talked about Iris. Publicly, specifically, personally for the first time since her husband's death had made their family a subject of polite, careful sympathy in certain Chicago circles. She talked about the 6-year-old who had sung along to every song, who had narrated her own life out loud as though the telling of it was part of the living of it. She talked about the 9-year-old who had stopped smiling in public, who sat at tables in her mother's world with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the tablecloth, and how Caroline had looked at that and built programs and funded initiatives and hired the best people she could find and told herself that was love. She talked about the night at the charity gala when she had watched a man in a work jacket crouch down in front of her daughter and sign something that made Iris laugh for the first time. In 3 years, a real laugh, unmanaged, the kind that belongs to a person and not a performance. She talked about the gymnasium on the south side and 12 children in folding chairs and a boy who wanted to be a pilot despite the problem with the radio. She talked, with the particular difficulty of saying true things that reflect badly on yourself, about what it had cost her to be skilled at running a program for children like Iris, while being far less skilled at simply being present for Iris herself. She did not call it a defense. She did not frame it as a response to anything. She told the truth, plainly, in front of cameras and notepads, and when she finished, the room held the specific quiet of a space where something real has happened, and nobody wants to be the first to break it. That night, she received a text from a number saved under a first name only. I saw it. You didn't read from a script. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the screen for a long time. Then she typed, I'm learning to sign. Properly this time. His reply came after a few minutes. How's it going? She thought about the 45 minutes she had spent that week with a YouTube tutorial, and the workbook she had ordered and left on her nightstand, and the number of times she had practiced good morning in the mirror before she had the handshake right. I got good morning wrong 4 times today, she typed. His reply, that's 4 more times than yesterday. She set the phone on the nightstand beside the workbook. The apartment was quiet around her Chicago traffic, distant, a dog somewhere on the street below. She opened the workbook to the marked page and kept going. 4 months passed with the compressed quality of months that are full of purpose. The Foundation's expanded program launched in January at 5 Chicago public schools hearing loop installations, twice weekly ASL enrichment, family support resources. The donors who had sent concerned emails in October had sent contracts by December because it turned out that a CEO who went on camera and told the truth about her family was a more persuasive case for investment than any number of carefully worded communications documents. Senator Bowen had moved on to other leverage, the way political pressure does when it finds nothing to hold. James contracted with the Foundation for the technical installations. It was a professional arrangement they both acknowledged, and neither of them over-explained. He showed up, did what needed doing, and occasionally did more than what needed doing, spending 2 unscheduled hours one afternoon reconfiguring a classroom sound system that was interfering with a hearing loop because it needed to be fixed, and he was there and he knew how. Caroline did not audit his hours. Claire did not suggest she should. Iris and Luke went to the Saturday ASL class together every week. Iris had stopped pressing against walls. The end-of-semester gathering was held in late April at Marcus Elementary, the same gymnasium, which Caroline had requested deliberately without explaining why. 32 children came from across the 5 schools, with their families and teachers and the Foundation staff who had spent a semester making the thing work. There were folding chairs in rows, a cookie table with juice boxes, and a microphone that James had tested twice before the first family arrived. Iris had been working on something for 3 weeks. Caroline knew because she had watched her practice at the kitchen table after dinner, signing sequences to herself, stopping and restarting, occasionally pulling out her workbook to check a handshake. Caroline had not asked about it. She had simply been in the kitchen, doing her own work, present in the room, and Iris had practiced as though having her mother nearby was the most natural thing in the world. Caroline had noticed that. She had not remarked on it because some things are better received without commentary. When Iris stood up at the gathering, she did not look at her mother first. She faced the audience and signed with both hands, steadily a short piece she had written herself about what it felt like to move from a world with sound to a world without it, and what it felt like to find, slowly, that the second world had its own kind of language, its own way of being full. She signed about hiding spots, about the first time someone had spoken to her in her language without being asked, about her friend Luke, who had told her that the trick to being brave was just doing the thing even while you were still afraid. Caroline sat in the third row. Beside her, in the seat Iris had pointed to before the program began, was James. On his other side, Luke watched his father with the proprietary confidence of a child who knows he is someone's primary reason for most things. Caroline watched her daughter sign. She understood it, not all of it. She was still making mistakes, still practicing in the kitchen after Iris was asleep. But enough. Enough that when Iris signed the part about the hiding spots, Caroline pressed her lips together and breathed carefully, and James, watching the same thing, said nothing, because there was nothing to add. Afterward, in the happy disorder of cookies and stacked chairs and children running between adult legs, Iris crossed the gymnasium to where James was coiling a microphone cable. She tapped his arm. He looked down. She signed. "Luke said you taught him to be brave. Did you teach yourself too?" James looked at her for a moment. "I'm still learning," he signed. Iris received this with the gravity of a 9-year-old who has decided something is true. She nodded once. Then she turned and ran toward her mother. Caroline caught her. She held on a moment longer than Iris probably expected, and Iris, to her credit, held on too. Then Caroline stepped back and looked at her daughter and raised her hands and signed, slowly and carefully and correctly, "I'm proud of you." Iris stood very still and read every motion of her mother's hands. And then something in her face did the thing it had been doing, gradually, over these 4 months it opened. The careful protective stillness that had been there for 3 years moved aside. Not gone, perhaps, but displaced by something warmer and older, something that had been there underneath all along. She stepped forward and put her arms around her mother's waist, the uncomplicated hug of a child who has decided, for now, that this is enough. James was standing a few steps away, cable in hand. Caroline looked up at him over Iris's shoulder and raised one hand and signed the one word she was certain she had right. "Thank you." He held her gaze. And then he signed back. Not the expected response, not the gracious and obvious thing, but the honest one. He signed, "Finally." She laughed. Small, involuntary, entirely real, the laugh of someone who has been seen accurately and told the truth in the gentlest terms available and still has enough left to find it funny. Iris looked up at her mother's face and read the expression there and seemed to decide, with the practical wisdom of a 9-year-old, that whatever had just happened was good. She let go. She ran back to find Luke. And Caroline Weston stood in a gymnasium on the south side of Chicago on an April afternoon, surrounded by children who were learning to speak without sound and parents who were learning to listen in new ways. And she thought about a service corridor behind a ballroom and a man who answered 7 with his fingers, and a night when everything she had built had seemed, for a few minutes, entirely beside the point. There are things money cannot build. She had known that, technically, for a long time. But knowing a thing and understanding it are different processes, and the second one takes longer and usually arrives by a less direct route. It usually requires someone to sit down in an empty chair and ask exactly the right question without waiting to be invited. It requires a child to laugh when you weren't expecting it, and a man to cover that child with his jacket without looking to see if anyone was watching, and a Tuesday morning cup of coffee in a mismatched chair on 18th Street where nobody knew your name or your title. She picked up her coat. She walked toward the door. For the first time in a very long time, she left without checking whether the room was still running properly behind her. It was. She knew that now. And she knew, too, that the knowing had cost her nothing more than 4 wrong attempts at good morning and the willingness, finally, to sit down.